So I was asked by a coworker to take a look at an echo string trimmer, and how could I say no? Of course I was going to take a look at it, but fixing it, well, that's optional, but I am going to try and give it my best shot. The problem is that this trimmer is going to prove to be a real mystery because all the clues don't seem to add up. But what we find out about it might be a somewhat common problem with these, but I'll let you decide for yourself. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at this echo string trimmer. And the problem is that I don't know anything about it, but there's a pretty good chance that it's not going to start. Of course, I can always ask my coworker what they think the problem is, but that would take the fun out of it. Now, I'm going to try and repair this string trimmer, but yours might be different, so this might not work on yours. So if things are not working out for you, like in the video, please ask about it, and I'll be glad to answer your questions. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is take a look around, and even though it's in really good condition, there are some issues with it. Now, besides being incredibly dirty in certain spots, it would seem that the fuel lines would need some help, which isn't too unusual for a machine like this one. Although I'm not sure why the return line's been pulled out of the grommet, I'll just put it back in place for now. Now, there's also a fastener missing from the cover, which could happen by itself, but it could also mean that someone's already tried to fix it too. Now, it did come with fuel in the tank, which means we get to examine it. But this is also when we notice that the fuel filter line has come loose from the grommet. Unfortunately, this means we won't be able to try and start the trimmer. But it does give us a look into how this machine was treated. Now, the filter line is not bad, in fact it's still in good condition. But the part that's outside the grommet was kinked, which tells us that very little care was used on this machine. Next, I want to see if it'll start if we put fuel into the carb, and the results might surprise you. So it did not start, which is not good. Next, I want to check and make sure that we have spark by using a spark checker. Now, to use it, all we have to do is install it in line with the spark plug and watch for an orange glow from the bulb. However, this is when we notice our first serious problem, which has to do with the boot. As I was struggling with it, I noticed something was off about it, and I realized that the wire inside the boot was not in there. Now, at first, I thought the wire was missing from the boot, but it turns out it just slipped down inside it. I then tried to work the wire back into position, but it was obvious that it was going to need some persuasion. Now, of course, this must be the reason why the engine wasn't starting, so I was very hopeful that this would fix it. And after getting it back into place, we'll install the tester and see what it says. Unfortunately, with the way the lighting is, it's incredibly difficult to see the glow from it. Now this time I'll just cover the area to make it easier to see. So it looks like we have spark, which is fantastic news. Now before we try another test run, I do want to take out the spark plug and check its condition. I want to see if there might be something keeping the spark from happening at the plug, which I don't think there is. Now the spark plug is wet with fuel from the other attempts to start it, so I'll try and dry it off along with the engine. I don't know if you could tell, but there was a mist of fuel that came out from the spark plug opening. Now because the engine might still be flooded with fuel, I am not going to add any to it for this test start. Unfortunately, that was not good news at all. It didn't even try and start. What I'm going to do next is try and relieve any tension or stress on the spark plug wire and boot by changing its orientation. Now this is kind of a desperation move, but things are moving in that direction already. I just have to make sure I can feel that the wire is still located inside the boot after this. Of course, this wasn't going to be easy. Next, I have to wonder if the engine might be worn out. And the easiest way to find out is to use a compression tester. It'll measure how much pressure the engine can make, and the higher the reading, the better it is. Now, I'd like to see a reading well over 100 psi, and hopefully it's not any lower than that. So the reading is a very meager 110 psi, which isn't terrible, but it's also certainly not good either. What this tells me is that there is some wear on the engine, but then again, I'd expect it on a machine with this much time on it. So is the engine too worn out to run? Well, the answer is no. It just means that it's going to be down on power, but there's plenty of compression for it to start and run. So here's what we know so far. It turns out we have some compression, and we're adding the fuel, so that's not an issue. And according to the spark checker, we have plenty of spark and a good looking spark plug, so why won't it start? Now the engine could still be flooded, and if that's the case, no amount of spark and compression will make it run. The other possibility is that the fuel inside the tank is contaminated with water, and that's what's inside the engine and not fuel. And that's obviously going to interfere with the combustion process and explain the results that we're getting. So after giving it a good spray and rinse, I'm going to let it sit overnight and see if that'll help the engine dry out from the inside. And as you can see, I did take the spark plug out to help it out, but if you have more time to give it as much time as you can. Also, if you have the chance, you might want to take the muffler off to help the engine dry out. Now, even though the problem we're having is not with the carb, we can't rule it out as a possible future problem. And once it's completely dried out, the next item we want to check is the fuel in the tank. I'll just pour it out into a glass jar, that way it'll be a whole lot easier to check for water. Now the first thing that I realize is that the color is good, telling us that the mixture is not off. Also by the smell, the gasoline portion is not stale and old, so we can rule that out as well. But more importantly, we can tell that there's no water in it either, so unfortunately, bad fuel is not the cause of our problem. Now inevitably, some are going to tell me that a clogged spark arrestor screen might be preventing airflow into the engine, which makes sense. And luckily with the cover off the engine, getting to it is pretty easy. And after removing the fasteners, we can inspect the screen, but what we find is a bit eye-opening. So it turns out the screen is about as clear as you can get it with a bunch of cleaning, so it's not the problem either. Now, if the screen was covered in dark carbon deposits, this would all make sense, but right now we're right back to square one. Now, just because the screen is clear does not rule out a blocked exhaust port, which means the muffler has to come off. But what we see is even more confusing because it too is about as clear as you want it to be. There is some sobering news. You can see that there is some very light scuffing on the piston and rings. That would explain why the compression reading is a bit down, but without a rebuild, it's going to have to stay that way. The next possible cause for our problem is a short in the ground wire, which is causing intermittent spark. Now this can easily be checked by simply disconnecting the ground wire from the coil and then trying to start the engine. But before we do that, I would like to dry off the spark plug of all the fuel that's on it from my other attempts to try and start the engine. I'm also going to check that the gap on it is where I want it to be, then we'll install it. Now if you have the chance, you might want to replace the spark plug just to rule it out. But right now, I'm just testing to see if the ground wire might be our problem with this one. And of course, it wasn't going to be that easy. Now we know that we have spark, but what if it was happening at the wrong time? It wouldn't matter how much compression or spark we have if the spark was happening too soon or too late. This could happen if the key on the flywheel was sheared, causing a timing problem. Now getting to the flywheel is not going to be fun, but it does take quite a bit of time to get to it. But things don't go according to plan, which seems to be the theme for this project. So basically, we'll have to take the trimmer down to just the engine, which means we'll need to take off the fan assembly covering the clutch. I did, however, run into some problems, and it won't be the first time either. So it shouldn't be this tough to separate the cover from the engine, and I'll show you why it was. If you take a close look, you'll see what looks like a coated pin. But it turns out it's actually a bolt covered in thread locker that I broke the head off of. Who would put this much red thread locker onto a bolt? Next, we'll need to keep the engine from rotating, and to do that, I'm going to install a really long modified spark plug. The reason why is because the only thing keeping the flywheel on is the clutch assembly, which we'll need to remove. To do that, I'll be using a 3/8 to 1/2 inch adapter only because I don't have my 1/2 inch drive near me. I guess I could have skipped the long spark plug if I used my impact, but I decided to go this route instead. And since the flywheel is plastic, I don't want to use my puller on it, so I'll just put the clutch back on part way and then hit the middle to free the flywheel. Don't forget to hold on to the flywheel while keeping the engine off the table while doing this. And once it's loose, we can finally spin the clutch off and then carefully remove the flywheel from the engine. Now what we're looking for is the key, which is built into the metal piece in the middle of the flywheel. And you're looking to see if it's been damaged in any way or missing, but what we find is that it's in perfect condition. So I'm going to point to it to make it easier to see, and as you can tell, there's nothing wrong with it. Now this is really bad news for us, so after all that work, we still don't have any idea as to why this engine won't start. Well, if the key is not damaged, what about the seat for it in the shaft? Well, unfortunately, it too is in perfect condition. It seems like every item we look into is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing. In fact, I'm going to go so far as to check the front seal just to see if it might be leaking. but there is absolutely no evidence of a leak there, otherwise we'd see fresh oil from the seal. I even go so far as to check if the insulator between the engine and the carb might be loose. That's how bad things are going right now. Now, I don't mind a good challenge, but this one is proving to be quite annoying at the same time. So what I'm going to do now is remove the recoil so I can check the rear seal as well. And as you might have guessed, someone put way too much red thread locker on these bolts as well. And of course, I ended up breaking yet another bolt, which is quite frustrating. Now, I'm pretty stingy when it comes to stuff, and in my opinion, a little thread locker goes a long way. But whoever applied it on these bolts was either extremely generous or downright evil. Now, you can't get a good look at the rear seal because the starter assembly is in the way, so we'll need to remove it. And luckily the engine is still locked up, making this process a whole lot easier. Of course, you don't need to use a giant adjusting wrench to do this, but it gets so little use that I need a reason to use it sometimes. And with it loose, we can finally spin it off the crankshaft and expose the seal, but what we find is also very depressing, because it too is in perfect condition with no leaks whatsoever, so what could the problem be then? I don't think I've had such an irritating project since the Red Max blower, which was also just like this one. Now that one ended up being a bad flywheel, so this could be the same thing. So at this point, I'm going to have to step away and go to my quiet place and think about it, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm pretty stumped. So my question is, after seeing everything I've done so far, what do you think the problem might be with this trimmer? Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.